we're in a series that we've titled 7. We're dealing with the churches of Asia. And if you want to open your Bibles right now, it's in Revelation chapter 2. You get prepared. We'll read through that and discuss that here in a minute. I'm going to title this, when it comes to the church of Smyrna, Better Off Broke. And coming off of talking about Ephesus and the parallel to marriage, I was thinking this week about, my marriage. We're coming up on an anniversary here. And those times when you're just starting out and you got nothing, I think would be times that you just can't wait to get out of. But those are the best times. Because in the end, what you really do is you don't have anything as the world sees it, but you have everything you really wanted. It's the two of you against the world. And what will come is all out there in the future, and the journey is something you look forward to. And there's a sense for the church in Smyrna where that comes into play here. They are not in the position financially and physically that they may have hoped to be in. But as Jesus sees this church, he says, no. It's better off that you're broke because you're rich in something greater than the world has to offer. And so that's just kind of setting up what we're doing. I mentioned in the beginning of this series, something I find important is that as human beings, we've commented and thought and written so many books about what the church needs. When at the end of our Bibles are these short little letters where Jesus says, this is what my church needs. And so I really want to look at this more than just letters that were written to 7 literal churches, which they were, and we'll have some context for that. But in scope, these are issues that the church throughout all age and time are dealing with. And so we'll try to kind of relate to them as we go through. That being said, for me, the church at Smyrna is difficult to relate to. And I don't know if you'll feel that same way as well. But all week long I've been thinking, well, what do we do with this? How do we, as the church here at Pratt, deal with what we're reading in this particular letter? Because a church that's under extreme persecution, like at every level, they are feeling it. And one of the things that tugged at me a little earlier this week was to this church of the 7 that seems to be the most persecuted. Jesus actually says the least words. And it bothered me at first until I realized something that I think was on the Lord's mind here is that they didn't need a lecture. They just needed a little encouragement. They already had so much. They just need a reminder. And sometimes that's what it takes when you're feeling really under it. Now, that being said, the closest experience that I can think of to relate to Smyrna in my life was the time that I was spending preaching in Jamaica. I spent a couple of years going down there and helping out with the work there. People there were so unique to any of my experiences here in America. There was absolute poverty. I mean, the kind of poverty that when I study with people here, they look at that kind of poverty and say, how could there be a God? And yet in Jamaica, when they were actually experiencing the poverty, they never denied the existence of God. I found no atheists as I studied in Jamaica. They all believe God exists. And when we look at the poverty in other places that we don't experience and we say, how could God be good? Where they actually had nothing and didn't challenge the existence of God, they never even considered that God wasn't good. The discussions were all built around, do we have what it takes to fully commit to following Jesus? It was just such a unique experience, this open heart. In fact, the church in Montego Bay was started when several different women realized, I know God exists, and I know He's good, and I know my life has not measured up. But if I'm going to follow Jesus, it's going to cost me my home. I'm going to probably lose my boyfriend. I will be now fully in charge of this child. How am I going to provide for them? Where are we going to live? And all they thought was, well, what if we give it all to Jesus? This is going to be all we need. They were poor, but they were rich. And I got to tell you, 25 years of preaching here in the United States, there's only been one time that rivaled anything kind of like that sort of commitment. It was a teenage girl, a high school girl, was coming with friends that she had met at school that were Christians. And so as she studied, she got more and more excited, just never heard any of this in her background and her family. Went home and told her parents, like, look, I'm going to be a Christian. And they told her, well, you can do that, but you won't live here. And you won't have our support. They were just completely against it. And so she came back and she was telling me, look, I want to be baptized, but this is what my parents are saying. And I said, whoa. This is what Jesus talks about when he says, count the cost. And that's what I really felt when I was in Jamaica as well. Like, what's it going to cost you to do this? And she knew very clearly what it was going to cost. And Amelia said, no, I'm going to become a Christian. And she moved in with faithful Christian family and slowly worked on not just becoming closer to Christ, but kind of reconnecting with that family that had cut her off. And I saw what it was to say following Jesus means more to me than anything else. And I think it's very important for us to get that in Smyrna, they got that. And they were tested in that. You see, we don't live in a place where Christianity is illegal. In fact, we don't even live in a place where Christianity is largely looked down on. And in fact, in some ways, you could say it's kind of cool to be a Christian where we live. And that's unique. That doesn't really fit this picture. But none of that means that we don't need ourselves to count the cost. I was kind of looking through some stuff on Revelation and thinking about where John might have been. And it said that, so Patmos is this island in Greece, and it looks toward Asia Minor. And on a clear day, they say you can actually see the shores of Asia Minor from Patmos. And just imagine what John was going through as he could kind of look and see being isolated, that's where the suffering is going on, and I can't be there. And what they need is a word from Jesus. And so this word comes, and he's just hoping this is the encouragement that this suffering church needs. You see, the Lord's church was living in a time and a location that not only approved of, but encouraged the persecution of Christians. Just put this in your mind. If you're living here in Smyrna, you're surrounded by Judaism. In fact, it's said that before the destruction of Jerusalem, the Jewish-Roman War, a lot of Jews that actually did come out of Jerusalem went to Smyrna. That was like a large settling place for them. And so to Christians that lived there, they were under that persecution. They hated the Christians, the Jews did. And so they were under that. In fact, just kind of a little historical note, Judaism was the only legal or sanctioned monotheistic religion in Rome. Because Rome understood through the years, if we kind of push them on this, we get a lot of, horrible feedback back. So we're just going to let them be that. And so they used that to beat up on the Christians as well. They were not approved. They had paganism. Around everywhere you looked, idols, temples, it was a part of the worship. And your pagan neighbor didn't care that you followed Jesus. They were okay with that. They were just offended that you put away all these other gods. And then there were those that actually worshiped the Caesar in Rome. And what they wanted was your full allegiance to Rome. And when they didn't see that, they were willing even to put you to death. And so this is what the church is up against. These two major challenges they face were, first, persecution. If they refuse to declare that Caesar is Lord, they really put their lives on the line, and they know that. And so if you don't want to do that, the other choice is you could compromise. You could just kind of be as quiet as you can about who Jesus is, and maybe just even pretend or feign that you're on everybody else's side. And I got to tell you, I find it kind of soul satisfying that from Daniel and his friends to these Christians in Smyrna, that pretending to have faith in God was never an acceptable option. We're all in because he was all in for us, was the attitude there in Smyrna. Now, we'll read other churches where they did compromise, but it wasn't this one. You see, persecution or compromise, not a great selection, but what we read about in the church in Smyrna is that they were the ones that chose the first. We will take the persecution. They grasped that foundational truth that you aren't fully ready to follow Jesus unless you're fully ready to die for Jesus. And so keep that in your mind, and we'll read through this text starting at verse 8 together. Write this letter to the angel of the church in Smyrna. This is the message from the one who is the first and the last, who was dead but is now alive. I know about your suffering and your poverty, but you are rich. I know the blasphemy of those opposing you. They say they are Jews, but they are not, because their synagogue belongs to Satan. Don't be afraid of what you are about to suffer. The devil will throw some of you into prison to test you. You will suffer for 10 days, but if you remain faithful, even when facing death, I will give you the crown of life. Anyone with ears must hear and listen to what the Spirit is saying to these churches. Whoever is victorious will not be harmed by the second death. All right, I'm going to do this before we get into our application, just a little bit of background. And again, I will plug, if you've not looked up on YouTube, this Appian Media, they actually do all 7 churches, so you can kind of get some of that, and I wanted to do it all up here. And then they've put that all together in one special Trial and Triumph. And so if you find that, it'll be really helpful to you in this. The ruins of Smyrna are within the borders of modern-day Izmir. It's kind of one of those interesting things where the ruins are there and the modern city just kind of built up around it, right? So it's a great place, and you still can see a lot preserved from what was once there. Smyrna was easily the most beautiful city in ancient Asia Minor. I mean, it was just kind of what if you wanted to travel, you wanted to be here. They were the crown of Asia is what they were known as. In fact, on some of their coins, they proudly inscribed, first in Asia in beauty and size. I mean, there's a lot of pride to what they were. It was also a thriving center for Roman Empire worship. It was proudly proclaimed in Smyrna, Caesar is Lord. I would tell you just at every level, this was a difficult place for Christians to live and to survive. In fact, it goes so deep with Smyrna, almost 300 years before this. They were the first kind of outside of Rome city that built a temple to the Roman goddess Roma, because they were so excited about anything Rome, like our allegiance to Rome, the gods of Rome, they were all in. This says a lot about this town. They were trendsetters in this allegiance to Rome and Caesar worship. Almost everyone in Smyrna would have been excited when they heard, hey, look, we're going with Caesar worship here. You proclaim Caesar. They would have been all in, almost everyone. You see, Jesus had faithful followers in this city, and they refused to join in. And the truth is, it cost them dearly. And Christians, I was thinking about this. They had to understand what following Jesus, and it's called, because Jesus has been clear to everyone who would follow him. You will be arrested, persecuted, and killed. You are my followers. Or as John records in John 15, if the world hates you, remember, it hated me first. I read things like this, and I think in a time where Christianity is not looked down on, where we're actually pretty popular in our culture, one little insult just throws us over the edge. But have you heard what Jesus said? Don't let it surprise you. Don't you remember what they did to me? If you belong to the world, they'd accept you, but I've pulled you out of the world. And I think it's a part of just connecting again with this kind of commitment, because the truth is, the Bible reminds us, hell hates heaven, evil hates righteousness, the world hates the church. Christians in Smyrna knew this kind of persecution would purify them. They were on board with this. Just think about that. Sometimes it is better to be broke by this world's standards than rich by what the world calls well. There's no way, when I look at a town like Smyrna, that our modern health and wealth gospel would ever stick. Like, they believed in something so much more powerful, right? You come into Smyrna and say, hey, you declare Jesus as Lord, you'll be healthy, you'll be happy, you'll have everything you want. They wouldn't have a second for that, because they had committed to something much deeper, much more powerful. They were willing to give their lives for Jesus. And to that group, Jesus says, I know. When someone who's been through it sees it and identifies with it, there's something encouraging about that. And to the suffering church, he says, I know about your suffering, and I know about your poverty, and I know about the blasphemy. And I just we'll go through all those in a minute. But just think about the context again for Rome. The Romans really just didn't understand Christianity. They didn't know how to categorize it or place it. In fact, in most places, I think what they assumed was Christianity was kind of a knockoff brand of Judaism. Like, it's sort of like it, but maybe a little less developed. And so Judaism, again, being this officially sanctioned religion in Rome, meant they didn't have to do what everybody else had to do. And they created a lot of problems when Rome kind of pushed against that. And so recall the difficulty of Pilate when he's trying to govern Jerusalem, and the Jews are making this because of Jesus, because of the disciples of Jesus. And so initially Rome just figured Christians are like the Jews. They're sort of the same thing. And what changes their mind about this, and you can read about this in the book of Acts, is that when the church starts to grow, when Christianity starts to breed and kind of progress throughout the world, who gives the greatest pushback? It's the Jews. They go to Rome and say, this isn't right. Look what they're doing. And so this is what Jesus is addressing here. And so I'll start with this first thought. Jesus knows all about our troubles. There's something comforting in that, right? He says, I know the blasphemy. You see, the Jews were slandering the Christians. They said, this sect of people worship a criminal, one that actually was put to death on a Roman cross. How upstanding could that be? They claim that criminal they worship is actually Lord, and so they don't say Caesar's Lord, they say Jesus is Lord. And if you want something really scandalous, they get together in these weird little ceremonies and they eat flesh and they drink blood. Cannibals, in essence. And they have been tearing apart our families left and right. And so Jesus says their synagogue actually belongs to Satan. Now, he's not saying that you could go into a Jewish synagogue and there was this open satanic worship going on. This is important. He's saying Satan is using the Jewish religion to persecute the church. And we all know that. And we all ought to know this. Satan loves to use religion to bash what Jesus is doing, to fight against it. You see, the pressure this put on the Christians in Smyrna not only caused kind of a social problem, but in the end it actually ended up costing a lot of them jobs. It made them poor, like truly poor by this world's standards. And so Jesus says, I know your poverty. I love the Greek word there means that you're unable to meet even the most basic needs. Like when Jesus says, I know your poverty, he's not saying, yeah, it's been a rough week. He said, I know it. Just surviving is hard in this place. And history shows us that Christians were often at this time passed over for work, excluded from work, cut loose from work. They were held out of, sometimes even by choice because of what they represented, the guilds of the day, which was like an ancient union, right? So you're not in this, you're not getting connected. And there were actually times when the government authority made it okay to seize the property of Christians because they just were so on the outs with society. And here's something I believe. It's really easy for us to sit around and say, you don't need stuff to make you happy, when none of our stuff's being taken from us by force. And in Smyrna, it was just a different picture. They were being tested at every end, and so Jesus says, I know your suffering. I love this. The word used for suffering there means a crushing burden. All right. These Christians were under the gun, or more literally, the sword, shackles, and shame. And what they needed, what they really needed, was a word from Jesus. And it comes delivered by John. Now, just imagine this. You're in this group. I mean, it's just everything you can do to find some place to assemble outside of persecution. And you hear the Apostle John has sent a letter, and it's the words of Jesus. You'd be so excited to get ready to hear what Jesus has to say. You're under this crushing burden. You're tired. You're weary. And Jesus says, I know how hard it is, but hang on, because it's about to get worse. You know, according to Jesus, things were not going to get better anytime soon. And according to history, Jesus was dead on right. And so let's look at some of the message here, and maybe it's encouragement. So Jesus tells them, do not be afraid. Look at verse 10. Don't be afraid of what you're about to suffer. That is such a haunting thing to read when you know the history of this town. Don't be afraid of what you're about to suffer. The devil will throw some of you into prison and test you. You will suffer for 10 days, but if you remain faithful, even when facing death, I will give you a crown of life. And it's just really important from our perspective to kind of put in the idea of what prison would have looked like here in Smyrna. The prisons here were not about rehabilitating someone. They were just detention till they could eliminate someone. This is a real testing. And so Jesus tells them, I know it's been difficult, but it's about to get worse. And some of you won't make it. You just picture that. You've come into this assembly, you're sitting on the front row, you're a parent, your small child is sitting in your lap, and you're thinking, we're going to hear what Jesus has to say. It's just going to be exactly what we need. And he says, be ready, it's coming. Man, I'd be terrified to hear that. And Jesus says, don't be afraid. The word Smyrna means myrrh, which I find kind of interesting here. It's a fragrant plant that was actually crushed to get this beautiful aroma out of it. And I almost feel like Jesus is saying, hey, look, I get it. You're being crushed. You're suffering. I see it. But if you will do this for the Lord, it will make an aroma so beautiful for God. And you know this as well as I, that Jesus knew a lot about pleasing God by being crushed. You know, there's some times when just being faithful under the worst of circumstances is exactly what God needs from you. And Jesus was that same kind of sacrifice for us. And so how do you react to a message like this? Well, I mentioned I'd be terrified to hear this. My knees shaking as I hold my child. I don't think this looks good. This is going to be bad. And so the word in chapter 10 is don't be afraid of what you're about to suffer. I want to kind of just think about this for a minute. This is the most repeated command in the whole Bible. What God is after the most. I mean, just think about it. I don't think we think about this. This is what God tells us the most to be cautious about, is being afraid of the wrong things. Do not be afraid is said more than any other command that is given. And so as Christians, I need you to know this. If you've ever felt afraid, you're in pretty good company. Because God was all over Abraham and Isaac and Jacob saying, do not be afraid. He told Moses 3 separate times, Joshua 3 separate times, do not be afraid. The prophets, Jeremiah, Elijah, Ezekiel, even Daniel, do not be afraid. Paul, on 2 separate occasions, is reminded, fear not, I am with you. Jesus told his disciples, do not be afraid 10 different times. Like, he doesn't repeat anything that often. And so here's the message, I think, behind this repeated command. You do not conquer fear by simply changing your circumstances. The answer to my fear problem is not just make it all go away. The answer to solving the fear in our life is changing our perspective or the lens we see it through. And that's what Jesus is helping with. And so this is what he says. He said, I'm fully aware of what's going on where you're at. And it looks like you are absolutely poor, but I say you are rich. Now you imagine hearing that. Excuse me? This is one of those paradoxical statements. Jesus uses this a lot in his discourse to kind of throw the mind. And what he's saying here is not, I deny reality. He's saying what's real is beyond what you see. What you're enduring, the answer to that is not to change that situation. It's to see what I see in you. You are rich. And I know we get this concept. It's why Antique Roadshow, for as dull as it is so exciting to so many people. Because we all like the idea that hidden somewhere in the pile of junk is something that you can someday retire. Like, you didn't have to work for it, you just found it, you discovered it, and it is worth so much. This is one of my favorite ones, actually. It was a person in St. Paul, Minnesota, didn't realize that through the years this pocket watch had been held around. Evidently, carrying a pocket watch just went out of style over time. Found it one day, and because of its condition and because of its make, found out it was worth almost $3 million. And this is what I'm saying here. Sometimes what looks on the outside to be worthless, invaluable, and poor is priceless if you see it as Jesus sees it. And this is what the Lord is saying. You see, sometimes you are better off broke because you're rich in faith in Jesus. And the early church, it's not just Smyrna. They were often oppressed by the world they lived in, but the world couldn't crush the life out of Christianity. It's one of the things about the persecution in the book of Acts. Satan and the Jews think we're going to stomp this thing out. We're going to put this. They couldn't. They just fanned the flame. It spread everywhere. Hebrews 10 talks about people like this. It says, you think back on those early days. When you first learned about Christ, I'm going to stop for a minute. When I think back on the early days when I first learned about Christ, it was so happy and fun and a lot of great people around me. This is not the situation in which they became Christians here. He said, no, remember how you remained faithful, even though it meant terrible suffering. Sometimes you were exposed to public ridicule and you were beaten. I can think back in my life, there might have been a comment here or there in high school somebody made. Nobody ever really took it serious. You were beaten. Sometimes you helped others who were suffering the same things. And you suffered along with those who were thrown into jail. And when all you owned was taken away from you, you accepted it with joy. You knew there were better things waiting for you that will last forever. So do not throw away this confident trust in the Lord. Remember the great reward it brings. Look, it's clear to your neighbors you're poor, but I believe you're rich. Because you have what in Jesus Christ is more valuable than anything this world can offer. And so Christians are rich in the eyes of Jesus when they invest everything they have in him. You see, Jesus doesn't want us to fixate on all the things of this world, our kingdom that we build, that can be taken away from us. And we know those things, right? Moth and dust destroy, thief break in and steal. That's what we tend to do. So think about this. You might lose your job. Your home, your car could be broken into, taken from you. You might lose your stuff. You could lose your reputation. And you might even lose your life. But when Jesus is Lord, the point is, you didn't lose anything. What matters is there. And so John writes in 1 John 5:4, for every child of God defeats this evil world. And we achieve this victory through our faith. And who can win this battle against the world? Only those who believe that Jesus is the Son of God. That's the point. It's hard. It's going to get harder. But don't let go of Jesus as Lord. And so verse 8 again helps to remember who says this. It's the first and the last. The one who was dead but is now alive, is speaking to you. That is, I was the Lord before you ever had any suffering, and I will be Lord long after all your suffering is done. Believing that changes the way we face suffering in this world. All our hope is in a different place. In fact, I would tell you, Jesus prepared his disciples for this. Don't be afraid. There's your command again of those who threaten you. Do not be afraid of those who want to kill your body. I have lived in such ease all my life, I struggle to read that out loud. What do you mean, don't be afraid about those who kill the body? That's one of the things I worry about the most. I don't know why. No, what you ought to be concerned about, he says, is the one who can destroy both body and soul in hell. Fear God is the point. And this is the word of the Lord to Smyrna. Don't be afraid of the first death. That's inevitable. Be concerned about the second one. You see that? The second death in Revelation chapter 20, verse 14, the death and the grave were thrown into the lake of fire, and the lake of fire is the second death. And I'm not going to talk a lot about this. I just want to bring up something that I have felt. I have felt over the last several years kind of a growing pressure, a groaning, a sighing, a rolling of the eye at any mention of hell. Like that's, we've kind of decided, like, that's not going to win us a lot of fans. Let's just put that away. And it's not just the world that doesn't want to talk about it. Christians have lost their palate for hearing and talking about the idea of hell. And so I thought right now, at least, I'll make a pact with you. I will make a pact not to talk about hell more than Jesus did. If you will tolerate me talking about hell no less than Jesus did. Because this is important. If you're going to get to the reward part of this, you need to understand it is to those who overcome there is a reward. But the non-overcomers, the ones that give in, the ones that surrender or pledge allegiance to any Lord other than Jesus, if they don't stand with him, if they refuse to obey, there is a risk not just of a first death, but a second death. You see, this is the promise to this church in Smyrna. Whoever is victorious will not be harmed by this second death. That's what mattered. Now how? Well, these are the words of the one who lived, died, and lives again. They were rich because they invested their life, even though it looked like nothing was left, in one who could literally save them for eternity. They were rich not only because they invested in Jesus, they were rich because they had a hope savings account that was absolutely full. And I want you to think that in terms in your own mind. How comforting that everything the Christian in Smyrna faced was first faced by Jesus. And the crushing burden was relieved because Jesus was going to crush the enemy. Yes, I get it. And in the whole story, and this would have been a hard time to live through, the enemy kills Jesus. It looks like evil has won, but that tomb is empty. And because a tomb is empty in Jerusalem, we have an abundance of hope that no matter what Satan throws our way here, we can endure to the point of overcoming and receiving this reward. You see, Jesus wants us to remember that when we are filled with hope, nothing intimidates us. Just think about how powerful that is. It doesn't change how weak you feel on the outside and how weak you look to those who don't understand, but on the inside there is a hope that cannot be pressured against. And I would just say this in terms of the church. This pressure wasn't unique to merely Smyrna. Hebrews 11 talks about a faithful lineage we come from, and that faith is of the faith of Abraham, those who put their trust in God above all in this world and followed him faithfully. And I purposely left out the first half of this passage we read because all those stories end kind of cool. They win. But notice the recognition these Christians get. They were tortured. They refused to turn from God in order to be set free. All they had to do was denounce him. No, won't do it. They placed their hope, circle that, in a better life after the resurrection. Some were jeered at and their backs were cut open with whips. Others were chained in prison. Some died by stoning. Some were sawed in half. And others were killed with a sword. Some went about wearing sheep's skins and goat skins, destitute and oppressed and mistreated. They were too good for this world. I read that and I think, how much suffering has following Jesus caused me? And my immediate response is not much. Not much at all. This makes it a little difficult for me to kind of connect to here. These Christians suffered the unbearable because the hope they had in a better life was so full. And to them, Jesus says, yes, you'll suffer for 10 days. And I would mention 10 again in Revelation is not just a number of days. It's completeness. You know, they didn't just have to hide in a cave for 10 days and it was over. This persecution is going to go on for centuries after this. When it's complete, when this has been endured, if you've been faithful, even when facing death, I will give you the crown of life. Jesus knows. Before you get the crown of life, comes the crown of thorns. That's just how this works. But to those who endure the thorns, he promises a crown of life. And here's what we know. The thorns are temporary. The crown of life is forever. And so I just kind of read you one more perspective we need to have as Christians as we face this world. Paul writes to the Corinthian church, we're pressed on every side by troubles, but we're not crushed. We're perplexed, but not driven to despair. We're hunted down, but never abandoned by God. We are knocked down, but we are not destroyed. Through suffering, our bodies continue to share in the death of Jesus so that the life of Jesus may also be seen in our bodies. Yes, we live under constant danger of death because we serve Jesus so that the life of Jesus will be evident in our dying bodies. And so we live in the face of death, but this has resulted in eternal life for you. You know, there's this sense in this letter that we forget so often because we've been living in such comfort. Like any opposition, internal or external, puts us on edge and we want to battle back. And what the church at Smyrna knew is that persecution can bring about a purifying that we desperately need. Because in suffering, the church fully holds to the resurrection of Jesus. That becomes our power. He lives and we will live. We see this in the church throughout history, and I just kind of found it interesting. David Burko's book, Will the Real Heretics Please Stand Up? His opening chapter starts with the death of Polycarp, which actually happens in the town of Smyrna. Nothing that started here that was anti-Christian ended very soon. It was just a horrible place for Christians to live. This man happened to be born the year before Jerusalem was destroyed, and you can see the venom and the hatred didn't go away very long. He was killed in his 80s, actually. It's interesting how he was opposed his whole life, and they waited till his 80s to get him. But when they did, the story goes that he asked not to be tied to the stake that he was to be burned at. He said that the God I serve will give me the strength to stand here, as he will give the flames the strength to consume me. He was at peace. He was ready to go. You see, the persecuting mob never learned that the first death isn't the ultimate threat to Christians. We're all going to die. We don't want to face that second. We want to be free from the second death. So if we die with Jesus as Lord. And I've just kind of point out here something that's hard to say. I think sometimes we read the Bible like it's just another one of those encouraging posters, like the hang in there, kitty, you know. Jesus never tells anyone, just stay alive. Let that sink in. Like how much? We look for that much. Just get me through the day, Lord. Just give me encouragement. Help me have a little better time of this life. No, Jesus doesn't speak in those terms. What he says is, no matter what, just stay faithful. It might cost your life, but it's worth it. Because I've given you a crown of life that is forever. And I say this, for 2,000 years in every age, there have been Christians like these in Smyrna who were faithful, even when it cost them their life. Christians dying for faith is not just a first century thing, by the way. It's happening all over the world. There have always been those who, in counting the cost of discipleship, recognize, this might cost me my life. And they still said yes to Jesus. So here's the trouble I have. What do we do with this letter? How does Pratt look at what Smyrna is going through? Okay, so this is something we're going to do with this. I think this is a problem for me. It's where I've struggled. Because the complaints that I most often hear are, somebody moved the chairs around, or we need more parking, or, we were without a bathroom for 3 months. We've had masks on for 2 years. I think, how are we who say that going to stand next to those Christians in judgment and act like it's all the same thing? Oh yeah, tomatoes, problem's problem. It's not. How do you say out loud when these Christians gave their livelihood first, their dignity first, and then their lives to stay faithful? And so how in time and culture do we relate to a letter like this? And I think it's pretty easy to be a Christian where we live. I'm not ignorant. I know it may get harder in time. I have no idea what Satan plans to bring against the Lord's church in the next generation or two. But I would just maybe hang on these 2 warnings for this church based on what we read here. First is this. Comfort and ease can do as much damage to the church as the threat of life. So be cautious. Be careful. You're not comfortable because you earned it or deserved it. And it can be taken away and Jesus is still the same. And so just kind of get that in your mind when it comes to seeing this world. And the second, and it's just something I think about once in a while when I think about a persecuted church. Maybe we don't feel a whole lot of persecution because we're not promoting the Lord like we need to. We're not getting out there in the name of Jesus like we ought to. We're not standing firm for what matters to Jesus. And so there's just 2 thoughts to think about when you try to relate to the Smyrna Christians. And here would be a meditation for us. How would you respond to the threat of your life? I would like to think that I would just, here I am. Yeah, I'll give it all. I just think about that for a little bit. What pressure is that going to put on your family or your livelihood? What are you willing to sacrifice? Will you let the world crush all the Jesus out of you? Because if you do, it's not that Jesus wasn't strong enough. You surrendered it. And I think that all settles on this idea that there's no such thing as secret loyalty when it comes to Jesus Christ. That's something these Christians in Smyrna understood. They got this wholeheartedly. This is a part of the cost of following Jesus. And so when Jesus sees this, he says, look, everyone who acknowledges me publicly here on earth, I will also acknowledge before my Father who is in heaven. But if you deny me here on earth, I'm not saying your name to God. You're embarrassed of me? I'm not talking about you. I got a 30-year high school reunion coming up, and if I could rope Katie into going, I doubt we will, but I say to her when we get in, hey, look, we're here, stand over there, act like you don't know me. That doesn't honor her, right? If every time I leave the house, I notice that she left first and her wedding ring is on the counter, that doesn't honor me. There is no such thing as secret loyalty. And these Christians knew that. It's not real. Loyalty to Jesus must be very obvious. It shows up in how we live. It shows up in how we speak. And the world senses it. And the truth is, a lot of them will hate it. You can be okay with that. You see, it means that someday you might give up your life for Jesus. Or, and this is where it is for us, maybe the rest of your life, you've just got to grind out your faith. Stay at it. Don't give it up. Now, you may not lose your life for it, but you're not going to let go no matter what. And so here's what I think we could do with this letter. First, make the most of every day you have here to honor Jesus in every way. Lift him up, exalt him, praise him. Live your faith in Jesus with a boldness that comes only from Jesus. Like make that your goal. And the second, and I need to take this one more seriously because it is just so comfortable here. Pray for those Christians around our world that suffer. All over this world, there are Christians that are living under threat, just like those in Smyrna. And you don't have to know their name. You don't have to know what's happening. You just reach out. You lift them up before God. You don't leave them alone in your prayers. And so listen to what the Spirit says to the church. To those who overcome, there is a crown of life, and the second death cannot hurt you. Remember, if it comes to it, you're better off broke in this world. If you're rich in Jesus Christ, nobody can take that away. I do appreciate your time as we think through these letters.